It was just after 7 p.m. when Karoline Leavitt finally stepped out of the West Wing, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the White House lawn. Her heels clicked against the pavement, her phone buzzing in her palm with a mix of emails, news alerts, and calendar updates. Being press secretary wasn't just a job, it was a balancing act between fact and finesse, where every word could spark a headline or defuse a crisis. Today had been one of those days where the headlines seemed to write themselves. She tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto Pennsylvania Avenue, her mind racing through tomorrow's talking points. Inflation numbers were dropping, an international summit was in the works, and a new social media policy for federal agencies had sparked more debate than anyone expected. All of it swirled through her head like a never-ending ticker tape. That's when she saw him. Slumped against the side of a building just beyond the Treasury Department, a man sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, a battered Yankees cap pulled low over his forehead. His coat, frayed at the edges, hung off his thin frame, and beside him was a small, handwritten sign. "Just need $10 for a meal. God bless." Karoline was used to seeing people down on their luck around D.C. It was a city of contrasts, after all. The power brokers and policy wonks shuffled past the invisible ones every day. But there was something about this man, the way he sat, not begging or calling out, just existing, that pulled at her. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers brushing against the neatly folded bills she always carried for taxis and late-night coffee runs. Without thinking too much about it, she stepped closer. "Hey," she said softly, her tone miles removed from the polished, podium-ready voice she wore in the briefing room. "You need a meal?" The man glanced up, and for a second, Karoline felt something shift. There was something in his eyes, a flash of recognition, maybe, but it disappeared just as quickly. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough and low. "Just $10 for something warm." Karoline handed him a 20. "Get something good." The man's eyes widened, but he didn't argue or refuse. "Thank you," he said quietly, folding the bill into his pocket with hands that trembled just enough to notice. "Take care of yourself," she said, giving him a small smile before stepping away. It should have been just another passing moment, the kind you forget by the time you get home. But as Karoline walked the rest of the way to her car, something about the man stayed with her. There was something too familiar, like a half-remembered face from a story her husband once told. That night, as she set her purse down on the kitchen counter and kicked off her shoes, her husband, Mark, was already at the stove, stirring a pot of chili. The scent filled the house, warm and comforting. "How was today?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. "Same circus, different day," Karoline said, grabbing a glass of water. "Though, something weird happened on the way home." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" "I gave a guy some money. Homeless guy, sitting near Treasury. But I don't know, something about him just stuck with me." Mark set the spoon down, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What did he look like?" Karoline tilted her head, trying to pull up the image in her mind. "Middle-aged maybe? Late 40s? Yankees hat. Kind of thin, like he'd been on the street for a while." The dish towel slipped from Mark's hands. "What?" she asked, catching his sudden change in expression. Mark swallowed hard, his jaw tightening slightly. Did he have a scar? On his left hand? Like a jagged line, almost like a lightning bolt?" Karoline's stomach flipped. "Yeah," she said slowly. "I think so." "Why?" Mark's face paled, and for a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the floor like the answer was somewhere between the tiles. "Karoline," he said quietly, "I think you just gave money to Ethan." "Ethan who?" "Ethan Cross," Mark said, his voice catching. "My old business partner." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like it pressed against the walls. Karoline stared at him, the gears in her mind grinding to connect dots she didn't know existed. "I thought you said he disappeared," she said. Mark nodded slowly. "He did." Karoline leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You said Ethan disappeared. What happened?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. The pot of chili bubbled on the stove, but neither of them cared. We started the company together. You know that part. Back when we were just out of college, still dumb enough to think we could change the world with an app. She nodded. She'd heard the early chapters before how Mark and Ethan had created a tech consulting firm, riding the first wave of cloud innovation. They were young, scrappy, and successful enough to land some big government contracts before most companies even knew what cloud computing was. But Ethan was different, Mark said, his voice dropping lower. He wasn't just brilliant, he was relentless. He lived and breathed that company. When we started making real money, I thought we'd both finally relax a little. Take vacations. Enjoy the success. He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his mouth. But Ethan couldn't stop. The pressure got to him, and so did the drinking. Karoline's brow furrowed. This part was new. We started fighting about everything. Mark went on. How much to reinvest, who to hire, whether we should go public. It got ugly, really ugly. One night, after a bad argument, Ethan just left. Walked out of the office and didn't come back. Did you ever try to find him? Karoline asked. I did at first, Mark said. But he didn't want to be found. He drained his accounts, sold off what stock he had, and vanished. I heard rumors that he was bouncing between cities, couch surfing, doing freelance tech work under fake names. Karoline's mind flashed back to the man on the sidewalk, to the trembling hands and the flicker of something familiar in his eyes. That was 10 years ago, she said softly. You haven't heard from him since? Mark shook his head, the weight of it settling into his shoulders. Not a word. The kitchen felt colder now, the warmth from the stove barely touching them. Karoline could see the flickers of guilt in Mark's expression, the what-ifs and should-haves that piled up over a decade of silence. What do you want to do? Karoline asked. Mark hesitated. Are you sure it was him? I didn't know to look for a scar, she admitted. But I can go back. See if he's still there. Mark's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing behind his eyes. If it's him, I can't just leave him out there. Karoline reached out, covering his hand with hers. Then we find him. Mark looked up at her, the weight in his expression softening just a little. You'd do that? Of course, she said. He's part of your story, part of you. And if we can help him, we should. The tension eased, just a bit, but the uncertainty still lingered. For all they knew, Ethan Cross wasn't the same man Mark remembered. 10 years on the street could break anyone. Let's go tomorrow, Karoline said, her voice gentle but firm. Together. Mark nodded, but Karoline could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, not just fear of what they'd find, but fear of seeing a ghost from the life he tried to leave behind. That night, long after Karoline had gone to bed, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. The past wasn't supposed to come back. It was supposed to stay buried, a collection of mistakes and regrets boxed up and shoved into the attic of his memory. But now, it was sitting on the sidewalk, wearing a Yankees hat, asking for $10. Mark swirled the whiskey in his glass, the faint clink echoing in the quiet house. Ethan, he whispered, as if saying the name might summon him. Tomorrow, he would find out if there was anything left of the man he once called his best friend. The next morning, Karoline Leavitt was back in the power suit, her phone buzzing with texts from staffers who were already knee-deep in briefing materials. The usual whirlwind of political theater swirled around her, but her mind was somewhere else, somewhere colder, where a man with trembling hands and a Yankees cap sat against the side of a building. Mark was quiet on the drive into the city. The usual morning banter between them was absent, no playful teasing about who left the toothpaste cap off or whether chili counted as breakfast. In Mark's world, it did. Instead, silence filled the car, broken only by the rhythmic click of the turn signal and the hum of NPR in the background. They parked near the Treasury Building, where Karoline had seen the man the night before. The city was awake now, bustling with staffers clutching coffee cups and interns walking just a little too fast to impress someone important. But the corner where Ethan had sat was empty. Karoline glanced at Mark, who was already scanning the sidewalk like a man hunting for a ghost. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his jaw tight enough to crack. "Let's check the park," Karoline said softly. They made their way down the street, weaving through joggers and tourists snapping photos of the White House through the bars of the north fence. Every so often, Mark would slow near a bench or a group of men sharing coffee from a thermos, his eyes flickering with hope and dread in equal measure. At a small plaza near Pershing Park, they finally spotted him. The Yankee's cap was unmistakable, but it was the way Ethan sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together like they were the only thing holding him upright, that made Mark stop in his tracks. "That's him," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Karoline touched his arm. "You ready?" "No," Mark admitted. "But let's do it anyway." They approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Karoline stayed just a step behind, letting Mark take the lead. Up close, Ethan looked even thinner than she remembered. His beard was patchy, his skin weathered in a way that went beyond just the years. This was the kind of aging life on the street carves into a person. "Ethan," Mark said, his voice soft but clear. The man didn't look up right away. It was like the name had to travel through layers of memory and disbelief before it landed somewhere he could reach. Slowly, Ethan lifted his head, squinting against the morning light. His eyes locked onto Mark's. For a long, breathless moment, either man spoke. They just stared, two men who had once shared an office, dreams, and more late-night pizzas than they could count. Now one was a successful consultant with a home in Alexandria, and the other was wearing his entire life on his back. "Mark?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken much lately. "Yeah," Mark said, his throat tight. "It's me." Ethan blinked hard, like he was making sure this wasn't some cruel hallucination. "You found me." Karoline stepped forward, her voice gentle. "I saw you yesterday," she said. "I didn't know it was you." "I'm Karoline." Ethan's gaze flicked toward her, recognition dawning slowly. You're married to Mark?" She nodded. Ethan shook his head, a humorless chuckle escaping his cracked lips. "Damn. Guess life kept moving after I stepped off." Mark swallowed hard. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you something to eat." Ethan hesitated. There was pride tangled up with the hunger in his eyes, the kind of pride that had kept him on the street instead of calling the only friend who might have answered. But eventually, hunger won out. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from hours on the cold bench. They found a quiet diner a few blocks away, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee strong enough to melt the spoon. Ethan sat across from Mark, his hands wrapped around the steaming mug like it was the only warmth he'd felt in weeks. "You look good," Ethan said after a while, his voice low. "Better than me." "Ethan," Mark started, but Ethan shook his head. "No pity, okay? I made my choices." Mark's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "We both made choices." Ethan stared down at the table, the silence stretching between them like a canyon. Karoline stayed quiet, letting them find their way back to each other, or at least, to whatever was left. Finally Ethan spoke. "Why now? Why find me?" "Because you were my best friend," Mark said, his voice cracking just slightly. "And because you're still here." Ethan's eyes shone with a glimmer of something, shame, maybe, or gratitude too fragile to hold. "I didn't think I deserved to be found." Karoline leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. "Everyone deserves to be found." Ethan looked at her, the polished press secretary who spent her days fielding tough questions from the nation's press corps, and he saw something else, something real. Someone who gave a stranger $20 without knowing his name. "I'm not the guy you remember," Ethan said. "Neither am I," Mark replied. "But maybe we can figure out who we are now." Ethan's lip trembled, just for a second. He took a shaky breath and nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe we can." The check was already paid, but none of them made a move to leave. The three of them sat in the worn vinyl booth, Mark, Karoline, and Ethan each quietly processing what the next step might even look like. The diner bustled around them, waitresses topping off coffee, the clatter of plates and silverware filling the air, but inside their small corner, it felt like the world had narrowed to just them. "So," Ethan said, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "What now? You gonna give me some cash, pat me on the back, and hope I don't drink myself to death?" Mark shook his head. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Ethan's eyes locked on his, a flash of defiance peeking through the weariness. "Because I know how this works. People feel guilty, they try to save you so they can sleep at night. But you can't just swoop in and fix me, Mark." Mark swallowed, his throat tight. "I'm not trying to fix you. I couldn't leave you out there. Not after everything." Ethan huffed softly, but it wasn't anger. It was the sigh of someone too tired to fight, too worn down to push people away anymore. "I appreciate the meal," he said, softer this time. "But I don't need a hero." "No," Mark said, leaning forward. "But maybe you could use a friend." That landed differently. Ethan's eyes flickered, some wall inside him shifting just a little. A friend. Not a savior, not a project, a friend. Karoline could see it happening, that thin crack where hope crept in, even if Ethan was afraid to admit it. "There's no pressure," she said gently. "We just want you to know we're here." Ethan gave a small nod, his fingers tapping a rhythm against the table, his mind already spinning with doubt and hesitation. Trust didn't come easy when you'd been on the street. You learned that the hard way. "I've got a motel over on K Street," Ethan said after a moment. "When I can swing the cash for it." Mark frowned. "How long have you been staying there?" "On and off," Ethan shrugged. "Couple of weeks here, a couple of nights there. Depends." "Depends on what?" Karoline asked. Ethan gave her a lopsided smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Whether I drink the money or spend it." There it was, the truth laid bare, sharp and unflinching. Mark didn't recoil, and neither did Karoline. There was no judgment in her expression, just the quiet calculation of someone who'd spent enough time in politics to understand that everyone, even the people society ignored, had a story. "You could stay with us," Mark offered, the words spilling out before he could think better of them. Ethan's head snapped up. "Absolutely not. It's not charity," Mark said quickly. "It's just a place to get your bearings. Shower, sleep, eat something decent." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You have a life. A career." He glanced at Karoline, his mouth quirking up. "You're the damn White House press secretary, for God's sake. You can't have me sleeping on your couch." Karoline smiled, her head tilting slightly. "You'd be surprised how many times reporters have slept on my couch after too much bourbon." That drew a real laugh from Ethan, the first she'd heard. It was rough around the edges, but it was there. "Look," Mark said, leaning back. "We're not trying to control you, Ethan. But you're not alone, even if you want to believe you are. If you need space, fine. But if you need something else, a real shot at getting back on your feet, we want to help." Ethan's fingers twitched, like they were itching for the bottle he wasn't holding. "And if I screw it up?" "Then you screw it up," Mark said simply. "We try again." The simplicity of it seemed to disarm Ethan more than any speech ever could. No grand plan, number 12-step script. Just a friend, one who was willing to walk alongside him, even if he stumbled. The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different. Less tense, more fragile. Like all three of them were balancing on the edge of something none of them could name. Finally, Ethan exhaled sharply. "One night," he said. "Maybe two. That's all I'm promising." Mark grinned, relief flooding his expression. "Deal." Karoline stood, smoothing her coat. "We've got a guest room. It's not fancy, but the sheets are clean." Ethan's lips twitched into something like a smile. "Clean sheets are fancy enough for me." They left the diner together, Mark and Ethan walking side by side like they were still in their 20s, planning their next big pitch. But the weight of 10 lost years hung between them, not heavy enough to crush them, but heavy enough to make them careful. As they reached the car, Karoline glanced over at Ethan. "I'm glad you're coming with us," she said softly. Ethan didn't look at her, but his voice was quiet and real. "Me too." For the first time in a long time, Ethan Cross didn't feel invisible. The ride back to Alexandria was quiet. Ethan sat in the back seat, his hands folded in his lap, eyes flicking from side to side as they passed manicured lawns and neat brick homes. It was a long way from the alleys and bus shelters he'd been calling home. He hadn't been inside a real house in years, not counting the motels with stained carpets and locks that barely worked. This was something different. Something unsettling. Karoline glanced at Mark, the subtle tension in his shoulders impossible to miss. Neither of them knew exactly what they were signing up for, only that they couldn't leave Ethan on that bench. That was the easy part, the promise to help. What came next? That was the messy part. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan shifted in his seat, like the sight of a two-story home with a porch and a well-kept yard was too much to process. "Nice place," he muttered, though his tone was unreadable. "It's home," Mark said. "Come on." The inside smelled like lemon cleaner and faint traces of chili from the night before. Ethan hesitated just inside the front door, his fingers brushing against the edge of the hallway table, like he was afraid the whole house might vanish if he touched it too firmly. "Guest room's up here," Karoline said, leading him upstairs. The room itself was simple, soft gray walls, a bed that was made with military precision, and a small desk tucked into the corner. It looked lived in but not too personal. "Safe." Ethan stood in the doorway, his weight shifting from foot to foot. "You can lock the door if you want," Karoline said gently. "Whatever makes you comfortable." Ethan glanced at her, something like gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thanks." They left him alone to settle in. Downstairs, Mark leaned against the kitchen counter, exhaling slowly. "What are we doing?" he asked quietly. Karoline poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "We're helping someone you love." Mark turned the mug in his hands, the warmth grounding him. "I just don't know if I can handle it if he falls apart again." Karoline leaned against the counter beside him. "We don't have to have all the answers today. We just have to show up." Upstairs, Ethan stood by the window, looking down at the quiet suburban street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A kid rode past on a scooter. Ordinary life. A life he hadn't been part of for a long, long time. The bed looked too clean. The walls felt too solid. But when he opened the nightstand drawer and found a fresh notebook and a pen sitting there, something about it hit him square in the chest. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees. He'd promised himself 1,000 times that if he ever got a second chance, he wouldn't screw it up. But second chances were a lot scarier when they were real, when they weren't just some daydream to get you through the night. Dinner was quiet. Karoline made spaghetti and garlic bread, nothing fancy, but Ethan ate like a man who hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. No one made a big deal of it. No awkward questions. No prying into the darker parts of his story. They talked about old times, the early days of the business, the dumb inside jokes that had gotten them through 16-hour workdays. The easy laughter was still there, even if it was a little fragile around the edges. But after dinner, when Mark was outside taking out the trash and Karoline was rinsing plates, Ethan leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, his voice low. "You're too kind," he said quietly. "I don't deserve this." Karoline dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "Who gets to decide that?" Ethan shrugged. "Me, I guess." "Well," she said, her smile soft but unwavering, "I think you're wrong." He didn't argue. Maybe because he was too tired. Maybe because a small part of him wanted to believe she was right. That night, the house settled into silence. Mark and Karoline lay side by side in bed, both staring at the ceiling, either quite ready to sleep. "He's not the same guy," Mark whispered. "Neither are you," Karoline whispered back. "People change. Doesn't mean they're not worth saving." In the guest room, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, the notebook open on his lap, the pen resting against his fingers. He hadn't written anything in years. But tonight, with the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls, he started to write. Not a story. Not a confession. Just a list. Things I miss. Waking up and knowing where I am. Coffee that isn't burned. Mark's terrible jokes. Not being afraid all the time. He stopped, the pen trembling slightly in his grip. The words felt too raw, too honest. But they were real. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Downstairs, Karoline's phone buzzed with a late-night alert. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more headlines, more chaos. But for tonight, she turned the phone face down. Some stories, after all, didn't need an audience. Some stories just needed a chance.